The vaulted ceilings arched impossibly high above me, their gilded frames glimmering in the sunlight that poured through crystalline windows. Every inch of the alien palace exuded grandeur and restraint, as though the building itself was meant to remind any visitor of their insignificance. Rows of courtiers lined the marble floor, their richly embroidered garments shimmering with metallic threads. I kept my hands folded tightly, a poor attempt at concealing the way my palms sweated. My presence here was tolerated, not welcomed, and I could feel the weight of 100 watchful eyes measuring me, dissecting me, and ultimately dismissing me as less. At the center of this vast hall stood the throne, carved from a single block of pale stone, flanked by banners depicting constellations unfamiliar to me. Seated upon it was the alien queen, the undisputed sovereign of her people. Her very appearance seemed crafted to unsettle human expectations. Skin the color of polished sapphire, features sharpened to an otherworldly elegance, and hair like spun silver that cascaded across her shoulders. A crown wrought with crystalline shards rested upon her head, refracting light into fragments of blue and gold. She did not speak at first. She only watched me, her expression calm, unreadable, yet heavy with command. I had been warned countless times by my escorts to avoid any gesture that could be seen as disrespect. Bow too shallowly, and I would appear insolent. Bow too deeply, and I would look like a supplicant rather than an envoy. I chose the middle path, lowering my head just enough to acknowledge her sovereignty, praying it would suffice. When I lifted my gaze again, I found her eyes fixed upon me with a quiet intensity that made my throat tighten. "Human," she said at last, her voice carrying across the chamber with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "You stand before the court of Erendur as representative of your kind. You will speak truthfully, and you will listen carefully. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty," I replied, my words echoing louder than I intended in the silence that followed. The courtiers murmured, their whispers slithering across the hall like wind through reeds. I could not tell if they mocked my accent, my clothing, or my very presence. None of it mattered. What mattered was survival, political, personal, and perhaps even species-wide. Humanity's first official audience with her court rested on fragile ground, and I was its unsteady voice. Movement at the foot of the throne drew my attention. A child stood there, small and delicate, her skin the same luminous shade as the queen's, though softer, like twilight instead of midnight. Her golden hair tumbled in waves down her back, catching the light as she shifted nervously. She must have been no more than 6 or 7 in human years. The murmurs died instantly when she took a step forward, as though the court itself was holding its breath. The queen inclined her head slightly, an unspoken permission. The girl advanced down the steps, her eyes wide and luminous, darting between me and the audience. I forced a polite smile, uncertain of the protocol. Was I to kneel? Extend a hand? Pretend she wasn't there? Every possibility felt like a trap. Then, without warning, she broke into a run. Gasps filled the hall as she crossed the distance between us in an instant, her small feet pattering against the marble. Before I could react, she flung herself behind me, clutching at the back of my tunic with tiny, trembling hands. I froze. My mind emptied, awareness narrowing to the pressure of her grip and the sharp intake of breath that rippled through the court. The silence that followed was suffocating. The queen's expression did not change, but her stillness became something dangerous. Her courtiers exchanged scandalized glances. A few pointed openly, their faces twisting in outrage. Guards shifted on their feet, their hands tightening around the hafts of their weapons. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to move, not to breathe, not to worsen whatever fragile balance I had accidentally shattered. I dared a glance downward. The child pressed herself firmly against me, her small body quivering, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. She was not seeking play. She was not seeking mischief. She was seeking protection. From what, or whom, I did not know. Whispers grew into a storm. "This is blasphemy," someone hissed. "An omen," muttered another. "Punish them both," a voice urged. I could feel the collective fury of the palace converging on me, a heat more scalding than fire. My mouth went dry. I opened it once, then closed it again, afraid of saying the wrong thing. All I could do was turn slightly, enough to place myself between the child and the rest of the hall, a gesture as instinctive as breathing. Her fingers dug tighter into my tunic, and something within me hardened. Whatever danger lingered in these gilded walls, whatever power games played out between the queen and her court, this child was afraid, and she had chosen me. The queen finally rose from her throne. The rustle of her robes was the only sound in the hall, every voice silenced under her authority. Her steps were deliberate, echoing with the weight of centuries as she descended toward us. I braced myself, not knowing if I would be struck down or condemned on the spot. When she stopped before me, her eyes shifted briefly to her daughter, then back to me. For a long, unbroken moment, she said nothing, letting the silence crush me beneath its weight. Then her voice came, low and sharp enough to cut the air. "Why," she asked, "does my child hide behind you?" The words rang across the chamber, a question that was also an accusation, a demand, perhaps even a test. I had no answer, no explanation that could satisfy her or her court. My heart pounded as every pair of eyes bore down upon me, waiting, hungering for my response. And yet, for all my dread, I could not step aside. The child clung to me still, trembling, and I realized in that moment that whatever came next, the course of my fate was no longer mine to choose. It had been chosen for me, by a small pair of hands gripping my tunic, by an act of trust that had stunned an empire into silence. I lifted my chin, feeling the weight of her gaze, and prepared to speak. The queen's words lingered in the air like a blade drawn but not yet swung. Around us, the cortege stiffened, their whispers swelling into a tide of outrage and speculation. I swallowed hard, aware that any stumble in my answer could turn this hall into a tomb. The child pressed closer against my back, as though the folds of my clothing were her only fortress. Her trembling passed into me, steadying something I had not expected to find within myself. "I do not know," I said finally, each word measured, careful. "But she is afraid." I could not push her away. The murmur sharpened into a hiss. Afraid? Of what? Of whom? My words had struck the court like a stone into still water, ripples spreading too far to control. Some scoffed, others gaped, but all turned their eyes upon the queen to see how she would respond. Her face remained an unbroken mask, though her silence felt louder than any reprimand. "You claim ignorance," she said at last, her voice steady, controlled, but carrying the weight of judgment. "And yet my daughter seeks your shadow rather than mine. This is irregular." "I claim only truth," I answered, my voice firmer than I had expected. "If she believes I can shield her, then I will not deny her that." The gasps this time were sharper, more dangerous. A human speaking of shielding the bloodline of Arundel was blasphemy to some, treason to others. A guard's hand twitched toward his weapon before he caught himself. Still, I could not take back the words. They had left me like an instinctive strike, guided not by calculation, but by something deeper. The queen's gaze bore into me, pale eyes like twin moons over still water. "You would take responsibility for what you do not understand." The child whimpered then, a sound so soft I thought only I had heard it, but the queen's head tilted ever so slightly, acknowledging it. A ripple passed across her expression, faint, fleeting, but real. I wondered if her mask had cracked for just a moment. Before she could reply, one of her advisors stepped forward, robes trailing across the polished floor. His voice, rich with authority, carried easily through the chamber. "Your Majesty, this cannot be overlooked. The child's choice demeans the throne. The human has manipulated her, or worse, cursed her. He must be questioned, tried, and punished if necessary." Another joined in, a woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes that glittered with malice. "If not punished, then exiled. Allowing this affront to stand will plant seeds of rebellion. The people must see the queen's authority as absolute." The court chorused with agreement, the voices of power rising against me like a wave about to break. I stood my ground, though my heart hammered in my chest, and I realized with sudden clarity that I was not merely defending myself. I was defending the fragile hands that clung to me, the small, unshakable trust of a child who had chosen me in a place where every choice was scrutinized. The queen raised her hand, and the voices died instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than any outcry. Her eyes shifted between her courtiers and myself, and then, unexpectedly, she spoke not to them but to me. "Tell me, human, in your world, what does it mean when a child seeks another's protection?" Her question struck me harder than an accusation. My mind leapt backward to memories buried deep. My sister's small hand gripping mine as bombs fell in the distance during a childhood war. The neighbor's boy who clung to me during a fire. My instinct to shield them all without hesitation. I had not thought of those moments in years, yet here they surged forth, unbidden, as though summoned by her words. It means trust, I said softly. It means they believe, even without reason, that you will keep them safe. It is not chosen lightly. It is not a game. The queen regarded me silently, and for the first time her mask seemed to falter. A subtle tightening at the corners of her mouth, a narrowing of her eyes, as though my answer had reached her deeper than she wished to admit. Around us, the courtiers bristled, unwilling to accept the simplicity of my words. This is weakness, one muttered. No, another countered, though more hesitantly. Perhaps it is something else. The chamber had split. Some demanded punishment, others whispered of omens, and still others were silent, watching, waiting. The child's grip on me did not loosen, and her silence was louder than any voice raised against me. The queen turned, ascending a single step toward her throne. Her voice carried once more, cold but decisive. There will be no punishment today. The human speaks truth. The child's choice is his alone, and it will be honored. Yet truth must be tested. If he claims to embody protection, let him prove it. Let the court see with their own eyes whether this trust is deserved. The hall erupted again, but this time the noise was not entirely against me. Some voices cheered the fairness of a decree, others hissed in frustration, but all understood that her word was final. Guards stepped back, courtiers lowered their heads, and the queen's authority reasserted itself like a storm quelled by sheer force of will. I exhaled slowly, aware that the reprieve was only temporary. I had been spared execution or exile, but I had been bound to something larger, something far more dangerous. To prove myself worthy of the child's trust was not a task I had sought, but it was now one I could not refuse. The queen's gaze settled on me once more. You will remain here. You will face what trials I deem fit. If you succeed, your name will be remembered in this hall. If you fail, your bones will lie beneath it. Do you accept this fate? The answer was already decided, though fear twisted in my gut. To refuse was to die. To accept was to risk a different kind of death, slower and more uncertain. Yet as the child's small fingers tightened around mine, I realized I could not walk away. I accept, I said, my voice carrying louder than I intended, steady despite the storm within me. The queen inclined her head once, a gesture both regal and final. Then it begins. The courtiers bowed as she returned to her throne, their whispers filling the chamber once more. But I scarcely heard them. My fate had shifted in that instant, tied now to a child who should have had no reason to trust me, and a queen who had set me on a path I could neither escape nor predict. And as I glanced down at the small, wide-eyed girl still hiding at my side, I realized with a grim certainty that my survival was no longer just my own concern. The days that followed were a blur of ceremony and suspicion. I was not cast into chains, nor was I offered freedom. Instead, I was housed within the palace itself, under the watchful gaze of guards who never spoke but always followed. The chambers provided to me were resplendent, walls of polished stone veined with silver, silken draperies in deep hues of indigo and gold. But their beauty was a cage all the same. I understood well enough that comfort did not equal safety. The queen's decree had echoed through the court like thunder. She had given me a reprieve, yes, but one wrapped in peril. My worth was to be proven, not by words, but by trials. What those trials would entail, no one yet said aloud. The uncertainty weighed upon me, yet I found my thoughts circling not around my own fate, but around the child who had chosen me. Her presence was a constant, sometimes visible, sometimes only sensed in the hush of footsteps behind me. She lingered in doorways, half-hidden, her luminous eyes studying me with quiet curiosity. When she did approach, she did so with caution, as though fearful that the bond she had formed might break if tested too openly. Yet her questions came in whispers. "Are you afraid?" she asked once, her small fingers brushing the edge of my sleeve. "Yes," I admitted, for there was no point in lying. "But I am more afraid of failing you." She blinked at that, as though the idea of someone fearing for her sake was foreign. Then she smiled, fragile but real, and her hand tightened around mine. In that moment, I understood the conflict more clearly than before. It was not merely a matter of survival. It was about proving to an empire that human instincts, our reflex to protect, to nurture, to stand even when outmatched, were not weakness. They were strength. The summons came on the third morning. A guard appeared at my chamber door, his armor polished to a mirror sheen, his expression carved from stone. "The Queen commands your presence," he said, and though the words were simple, the weight of them was not. I was led through winding corridors into a chamber unlike any I had yet seen. It was vast, circular, its walls lined with banners depicting the victories of past rulers. At its center lay a ring of polished stone, wide enough to hold a dozen fighters. Already the court was gathering, their voices a low hum of anticipation. The Queen sat upon a raised dais, her daughter beside her, small and solemn. "This is the first trial," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner. "Strength and honor." A door opened across the chamber, and from it stepped a warrior. He towered above me, his body armored in scales that shimmered like obsidian, his eyes alight with the hunger of combat. A murmur swept through the court as he unsheathed a blade longer than my arm, its edge glowing faintly with energy. The unfairness of it struck me instantly. I was unarmed, my body frail by comparison. Yet when I glanced toward the Queen, I saw no mockery in her gaze. She was not seeking a display of raw might. She was seeking something else. The warrior advanced, each step deliberate, the flaw trembling beneath his weight. I shifted my stance, recalling lessons from years past, scraps of training, half-forgotten drills. He lunged, the blade whistling toward me, and instinct carried me sideways. The weapon struck stone where I had stood, sparks leaping into the air. I did not attempt to match his strength. To do so would have been suicide. Instead, I moved with purpose, keeping my distance, forcing him to chase me, to waste energy. Each time he struck, I twisted away, using speed and unpredictability to deny him satisfaction. The courtiers murmured, some jeering, others thoughtful. Minutes stretched into eternity. Sweat slicked my brow, my breath came ragged, but still I endured. Finally, the warrior's strike slowed, his breathing heavy within the confines of his armor. I seized the moment, darting forward, not to strike, but to snatch a strap hanging loose across his chest. With a sharp pull, I unbalanced him, sending him crashing to the ground. The hall erupted in noise. Some shouted outrage, others laughed in disbelief. I stumbled back, chest heaving, but still standing. The warrior rose to his knees, glaring at me, then turned his gaze toward the Queen. She gave a single nod. With visible reluctance, he bowed his head toward me before retreating. "Strength is not always muscle," the Queen said, her voice calm but carrying weight. "Sometimes it is endurance. Sometimes it is wit. The human has passed the first trial." The child's eyes sparkled with relief, and though she did not move from her mother's side, her small smile was reward enough. But there was no time to savor the moment. The Queen lifted her hand, and the hall fell silent once more. "The second trial will test wisdom," she declared. Attendants carried forth a low table, upon which they placed objects both familiar and alien, stones carved with symbols, metallic rods that hummed faintly, and sheets of parchment inked with spirals of text. I was instructed to arrange them into a sequence that conveyed harmony according to their philosophy, though I had no knowledge of their symbols. The court watched eagerly, many expecting me to fail. I studied the pieces, searching not for meaning but for patterns. The rods resonated when placed close together, their vibrations creating chords like music. The stones, though inscrutable, bore marks that seemed to echo one another, halves seeking their counterparts. Slowly, carefully, I began to arrange them, listening, observing, trusting my instincts rather than knowledge. When I finished, silence fell. The pattern glowed faintly, the rods humming in harmony, the stones aligned to form a complete circle. A murmur ran through the hall, astonishment, disbelief. The Queen leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as though reassessing me entirely. "You do not know our language," she said, more statement than question. "No," I admitted. "But I know balance when I see it. I know when something belongs, when it feels all." The child turned to her mother then, tugging gently at her hand. Though I could not hear her words, I saw her lips form them. "He understands." The Queen did not reply, but something in her gaze softened. She raised her voice once more for the court. The human has passed the second trial. A mixture of awe and resentment rippled through the chamber. Some applauded, others scowled, but none could deny what they had witnessed. Exhaustion pressed upon me, but I stood tall, unwilling to show weakness now. I had endured combat and puzzle alike, not by might or knowledge but by something far simpler, a refusal to yield. Yet even as the whole settled, I sensed that these trials were not the true test. They were only preludes, shadows of the challenge still to come. The queen regarded me in silence, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. You have proven resourceful. But the court remains unconvinced. One final trial awaits, and in it you will face not only your own fate, but hers. She gestured to the child, who looked at me with eyes wide as stars. My breath caught. Whatever lay ahead would bind us together more tightly than before. And though fear stowed in my chest, so too did resolve. The queen's words rang across the hall like prophecy. The true test begins soon. The final trial came, without warning. One moment I was standing in the great hall, the echo of the Queen's proclamation still hanging in the vaulted air, and the next the palace itself convulsed. The sound of shattering crystal ripped through the chamber as a side door burst inward. Figures clad in dark armor surged through the breach, their weapons glowing with lethal intent. The court dissolved into chaos, courtiers screamed, guards scrambled, and the air thickened with the acrid scent of burning stone. The attackers moved with precision, their formation cutting through the hall like a blade. Their target was not the queen, nor the throne, but the small figure beside it. The child. Even before the realization fully struck, she cried out, terror raw in her voice, and bolted from her mother's side. Her feet carried her toward me, as though the choice had already been made in her heart. I didn't think. There was no time to think. Instinct propelled me forward, arms outstretched, scooping her into my grasp as bolts of energy crackled through the space she had just occupied. I felt the heat of one pass close enough to sear the fabric of my sleeve. She buried her face against my chest, trembling, and I turned, shielding her with my body, eyes searching desperately for cover. The guards rallied, clashing with the intruders, but their hesitation was telling. Some faltered, others seemed uncertain where their loyalty lay. The queen herself rose, her voice a clarion call that cut through the din, summoning her power. Light erupted from her hands, searing arcs that struck down two assassins where they stood. The sheer force of her command was terrifying, yet I noticed how her eyes darted, not toward the throne she defended, but toward the daughter she could not reach. The child's grip on me tightened, nails biting into my skin. I crouched low, maneuvering us behind a toppled pillar as another blast scorched the floor. My breath came ragged, but I forced calm into my voice. Stay with me. I won't let them touch you. Her wide eyes met mine for the briefest instant, and I saw trust there, not blind, but chosen. It anchored me. I rose again, scanning the hall, and caught sight of one assassin breaking from the melee, his weapon leveled directly at us. He saw what I carried, and his stride quickened. There was no weapon in my hands, no armor upon my body. All I had was the will to stand. I shifted the child behind me and stepped forward, raising my arms in a gesture that was both defiance and defense. The assassin sneered, certain of victory, but in that heartbeat before he struck, the queen's power fled again. A beam of pure force shattered his weapon and hurled him backward across the chamber. He lay motionless, smoke curling from his armor. Silence descended slowly, like dust after a storm. The remaining attackers lay dead or captured, their strike undone. Yet the damage to the court was not measured in stone or bodies, it was measured in what had been revealed. The child had run to me again, and in doing so, she had proclaimed before the entire court where her trust lay. The queen descended from the dais, her robe sweeping across the ruined floor. She halted before us, her gaze fixed first on her daughter, who clung to me still, and then upon me. Her face was unreadable, yet her voice, when it came, was softer than I had ever heard it. You stood when others faltered. You shielded what even my own gods could not. Tell me, human, why do you risk yourself for a child not your own? I met her eyes, my heart hammering but my words steady. Because she chose me. Because no one, no matter how small, should cry out for protection and be answered with silence. If I had stepped aside, I would not be human at all. The hall was hushed. Courtiers leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. The Queen studied me for what felt like an eternity, the silence heavy with the weight of decision. At last, she extended her hand, not to me, but to her daughter. The girl hesitated, looking between us. Then, with a small, decisive nod, she placed her hand in her mother's. Yet even as she did, she glanced back at me, her expression clay. The bond we had forged would not be broken. The Queen straightened, her voice carrying with renewed authority. This court has seen the truth with its own eyes. The human is no deceiver, no pretender. He is protector, proven by trial and by blood. Let all who doubt remember this day. Her words struck the court like a hammer upon iron. Some bowed, reluctant but bound by custom. Others looked upon me with grudging respect, still others with suspicion, but none dared to speak against her. The verdict was sealed. Relief washed through me, though I masked it with composure. My body ached from tension, my lungs still burned from the smoke of battle, yet I stood taller. I had survived not by cunning alone nor by brute force, but by holding to the one truth that could not be denied. Humanity's strength lay in its heart. The Queen regarded me one final time, her eyes unreadable but softened by something I could not name. Perhaps, she said slowly, your kind is not as fragile as we believed. Perhaps strength is more than conquest. Perhaps it is the courage to stand when none else will. Her daughter's hand slipped into his fully then, but her gaze lingered on me, luminous with gratitude. In that look, I felt the threads of destiny tighten, binding my fate not only to his but to the future of two peoples. The hall exhaled as one, the moment passing into memory, but I knew it was not an ending. It was only the beginning of a story larger than myself, larger than any trial. For the palace had seen, the Queen had judged, and a child had chosen, and nothing would ever be the same again. The court did not rest after the failed assassination. Whispers spread like fire through the palace, each rumor more venomous than the last. Some claimed the attackers had come from a rival house, others swore the Queen herself had staged the ordeal to test loyalty. But beneath the speculation lurked one undeniable truth. The balance of power had shifted, and I stood at the heart of it. Everywhere I walked, eyes followed me, some full of suspicion, others of open hostility, and a few, though rarely, with gratitude. The child's decision to run to me had become a living legend retold in hushed tones, each retelling magnifying its weight. I had not asked for such attention, but now it clung to me like a shadow. The Queen summoned me often, her questions precise, her gaze unyielding. She wanted to know my thoughts on trust, on courage, on why her daughter favored me above seasoned guardians. Each time, I answered honestly, though carefully. I spoke not as one angling for favor, but as one who had nothing to lose but the truth itself. Still, I could see the conflict in her eyes, respect warring with doubt, gratitude sparring with the instincts of a ruler who trusted no one too quickly. The child, however, harbored no such restraint. She sought me out in corridors, pulling me toward gardens where the air was less stifled, where she could laugh without the burden of titles. In those moments, I glimpsed the weight she carried, the loneliness of being heir to a throne surrounded by ambition instead of affection. She would ask me questions, about life, about what it meant to play freely in streets without walls of stone, about families who sat at tables not of politics but of simple bread and warmth. I answered as best I could, weaving images of a life she had never known, and in her eyes I saw both wonder and longing. But the palace was not blind. The bond between us grew too visible, too dangerous for those who thrived on control. One evening, as I left her chambers after recounting another story, I found myself hemmed in by a cluster of figures cloaked in authority. They were ministers, advisers, men and women whose words swayed armies. Their leader, a gaunt man with eyes like sharpened steel, stepped forward. "You walk too close to the heart of the empire," he said, his voice low enough not to echo, sharp enough to cut. "You are a stranger in our court, yet already the child clings to you as though you were blood. That makes you a threat." I held his gaze, feeling the weight of their suspicion pressing against me like a physical force. "If protecting a child is threat enough to draw your fear," I said, "then perhaps you have mistaken power for safety." His lips curled into something between a smile and a snay. "Do not mistake her affection for protection. When it serves her future, even a queen's daughter will forget. But we, his hand gestured to the others, we do not forget threats. Step carefully, human. They disposed as silently as they had come, leaving me with a chill that no torchlight could warm. Their warning was not me posturing, it was a promise. My presence had upset balances older than I could grasp, and the resistance to me would not vanish with one battlefield display. That night I could not sleep. I replayed the words, the menace in them, and I thought of the child's laughter in the garden only hours before. The court would not allow such innocence to last. They would twist it, weaponize it, or crush it outright if it stood in the way of their designs. When dawn came, I sought the queen herself. I found her in the war room, poring over maps strewn with markers of enemies real and imagined. She looked up, her expression guarded. "You come unbidden," she remarked, though her tone held more curiosity than anger. "I was warned," I replied. "Your ministers see me as a danger. They are not wrong." Her brows arched slightly. "And you admit this?" "I admit that I stand between them and what they desire most, control of your daughter. They will not forgive me for that, nor will they forgive you for allowing it." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she set aside the map, folding her hands atop the table. "You speak boldly for one without power." I stepped closer, meeting her eyes without flinching. Power is not only in armies and councils. Sometimes it is in who a child trusts when she is afraid. You know this better than any of them. That is why they fear me. Not because of what I am, but because of what she sees in me. The queen's gaze softened, barely, but enough for me to notice. She leaned back, considering. "You understand too much, and too quickly. It makes you valuable and dangerous. Do you intend to stay in this palace, human? Or will you leave before the weight of your presence breaks what fragile peace remains?" The question struck harder than I expected. Part of me longed to leave, to step away from the schemes and the daggers hidden in smiles. Yet when I thought of the child, of her trust and her laughter, the answer formed before doubt could take hold. "I will stay," I said firmly. "As long as she calls for me, I will not leave her side." The queen regarded me for what felt like an eternity, then inclined her head in the faintest nod. "Then be ready. The storm has only begun." Her words proved true. That evening, as twilight bled across the palace walls, a messenger stumbled into the hall, battered and blooded. His voice shook as he declared what he had seen, armies mustering beyond the borders, banners of rebellion raised high. The failed assassination had not been an isolated act. It had been the spark of war. The hall erupted in panic, courtiers crying out, guards rushing to secure entrances. The queen's face turned to stone as she rose, her presence alone silencing the chamber. But even as she gave commands, even as she summoned her generals and spoke of strategy, her daughter slipped quietly to my side, her small hand finding mine. She looked up at me, eyes wide but steady. "Will you protect me when the war comes?" she whispered. I tightened my grip, the answer leaving my lips before thought could intervene. "Yes, always." And in that vow, I felt the weight of everything yet to come, the fury of rebellion, the wrath of ministers, the unrelenting tide of destiny. The storm had broken, and I was no longer an outsider. I was part of the heart of it. The rebellion did not wait for diplomacy. By the time scouts confirmed the size of the enemy force, the first villages along the border had already fallen. Refugees streamed into the capital, their faces hollow with fear, their stories filled with fire and slaughter. The palace grew tense, every corridor humming with urgency, every council chamber heavy with suspicion. The queen convened her generals daily, their voices echoing through stone halls as they argued over defenses, strategies, and betrayals. I was not meant to hear these words, yet I did, sometimes because the child clung to me and refused to leave my side, sometimes because the queen herself summoned me into the room, demanding a perspective untainted by courtly politics. My answers were met with scoffs from her ministers, but she listened, and that alone widened the rift between us and them. The child sensed the danger even without words. At night, when the palace slept uneasily, she crept into the chamber where I was quartered, her small form trembling against mine as she whispered her fears. "They want to take me away from her," she said once, her eyes glistening. "They think if I am gone, she will bend." I held her close, The promise unspoken but unbreakable. I would not allow it. Yet I knew the ministers were plotting more than whispers. Every day the tension mounted, until even the Queen's most loyal soldiers glanced over their shoulders, unsure who stood with them and who plotted in the shadows. The war arrived at the capital gates sooner than any of us imagined. Horns blared from the watchtowers, and the horizon burned with the glow of enemy torches. The rebels had marched fast, cutting through defenses with treachery as much as steel. The Queen rallied her armies, her voice fierce, her command unshaken, but in her eyes I saw what she would not say aloud. The enemy's true prize was not the throne, but her daughter. The night of the siege was a blur of fire and thunder. Arrows rained like black rain, stones from catapults shattered towers, and the screams of the dying wove through every street. I carried the child through smoke-filled corridors, ducking as debris fell, urging her to stay silent as we slipped between soldiers. My only thought was to keep her alive. We reached the inner sanctum, a hidden chamber carved deep within the palace walls, a place of last refuge. But even there the war found us. The enemy breached faster than anyone predicted, their assassins infiltrating the palace itself. One slipped into the chamber as I barred the door, his blade gleaming with venomous intent. I lunged without thought, grappling him in the dim light. His strength was brutal, his strikes merciless. We crashed against the stone, his knife inches from my throat. I thought of the child behind me, of her terrified eyes, and rage surged through me. With a final desperate push, I drove him backward into the wall. His blade clattered away, his body fell still, and the chamber filled with silence save for my ragged breaths. The child rushed to me, her arms wrapping around my waist. She was sobbing, but her voice was fierce. "Don't leave me. Promise you'll never leave me." I dropped to my knees, gripping her shoulders, forcing her to meet my eyes. "I promise. Not while I still draw breath." When the Queen burst into the chamber moments later, her robes torn, her face marked by battle, she found us like that, me kneeling, the child clinging to me, the corpse of an assassin at our feet. For the first time since I had met her, the Queen's composure cracked. She knelt beside her daughter, drawing her close, then looked at me with something that was not merely gratitude but recognition. "You have done more than protect her," she said quietly, though the thunder of war still shook the walls. "You have made her believe she can be safe. That is a power even I could not give her." The fighting raged for days, but the tide shifted. The Queen's armies, rallied by her unbreakable will, pushed the rebels back. Victory came at a terrible cost. Half the palace lay in ruins, the dead were too many to count. But when the smoke cleared, the capital still stood. The rebellion had broken itself against its walls. In the aftermath, the court gathered once more in the great hall, though it was scarred by battle. The Queen stood before them, her daughter at her side. She addressed her ministers with a voice that brooked no denial. "You sought to question him," she declared, pointing toward me. "You called him threat, deceiver, usurper. Yet when your blades faltered, when your loyalty crumbled, it was he who stood. He who shielded my daughter when all others failed. This court will remember, humanity does not mean weakness. Humanity has saved your Queen's bloodline." The hall fell into silence. No one dared object. Some bowed in grudging acknowledgement, others looked away in shame. I felt the weight of their stays, but no longer as an outsider. I had become something they could not erase from their memory, no matter how much they wished it. The Queen turned then, placing her hand on her daughter's shoulder. The child smiled faintly, her eyes seeking mine. In that moment, I knew the bond between us was no longer just chance. It was destiny forged in fire and fay. As the hall dispersed, the Queen approached me alone. "This war is not the end," she said. "Others will rise, enemies within and without. But now, when I look at you, I see not just a stranger, but a shield. Perhaps even more." Her words lingered long after she left. I stood in the ruined hall, the weight of smoke still clinging to the air, and realized my life had changed beyond recognition. I had come to this world a visitor, a curiosity. I remained not as a guest, but as part of its heart. And though the war was over, the true struggle had only begun. For trust once given cannot be taken back, and a vow once spoken binds more tightly than chains.